Hello, everyone. So, we are gathered here today to debate on the motion. This House suppose humanism over nationalism. On the proposition side, we have Piyush Gulati, Pranav Joshi, and Sakshi Arora. And on the opposition, we have Anmol, Kalash, and Jasleen. So, let's hear it from them. First, the proposition. The Prime Minister, please start with your speech.
All right. Timer is ready.
Yeah.
Okay, so starting my speech in three, two, one. So, panel, mainly I'd like to talk about three main things in my speech. Firstly, the core definitions of humanism and nationalism and what do they stand for in the current scenario. Secondly, the impact of skewed nationalism on an individual as well as the entire state. And thirdly, I'd like to talk about how humanism is a product of a moral high ground and why is it so much important in the current narrative. So, firstly, humanism is basically a belief that humanity as a whole is responsible for promotion and development of individuals, that there is an equal and inherent dignity that is attached to every individual, and that we all have some relation in it to the world. Secondly, humanism also tends to promote the fact that we as humans have the ability to, we have the agency and potential to evolve both socially and individually. Now, nationalism, on the other hand, is a belief that we keep a nation's own interests above everything else, and it also means that a nation should be autonomous and free from external control. Now, while these are the core definitions, it is important to analyze what do these definitions stand for in the current scenario. Panel, the definition of nationalism has been skewed throughout history, uh, especially because of the narratives. So basically, let me ask you a very simple question. What do you think constitutes a state? A state is simply people from different people having the same belief systems in terms of caste, religion, faith, or some common important metric coming together and trying to stake claim to a particular territory or trying to take control of resources which they feel fall under a particular territory. And these are territories formed by wishful thinking. Panel, nationalism as a concept is very inherently divisive in nature. Nations are nothing but artificial constructs that have been formed by man that lead to the formation of unnecessary boundaries and hence oppose the thriving of multiple cultures in a similar scenario. It is the same as saying that nationalism highlights the perceived differences that exist between people of different religions or nations, so to speak. This brings me to my next point, which is the impact of nationalism, the skewed nationalism on an individual as well as the entire state. So, firstly, I talk about the most detrimental effect of nationalism that we've seen, and that has a larger impact on the national international problems such as war, etc. Nationalism in its entirety is a belief which promotes a nation's own interests above moral principles and hence attaches a dangerously individual attention to a nation's own identity. Now, what this leads to is that when we view something from a nationalist lens, we do not view nations as simply nations existing in mutual harmony. We view nations as superior and inferior. We rank our nations above all everything. And this ordeal and panel, this superiority complex is the root cause of war. But let us not, and it has led to a lot of foreign attacks on foreign soil because of the radical nationalism. But let us not only limit ourselves to external factors, the external effects of nationalism. Let us look at what nationalism does internally in a country, because panel, it directs a lot of havoc inside the country also. So let us understand it. Panel, what nationalism does is that it suppresses individual identity for the greater good of a nation. And let us understand what this actually means. This means that people who are leaders or who hold a particular political pedestal, they have the avenue to manipulate the masses and in turn polarize them against minorities. So radical nationalism in its true sense is actually leading to radicalization and operation of minorities. Panel, we have numerous examples of how Donald Trump pitted an entire community of Mexicans and Latin Americans against the US native citizens, and that has led to a lot of hate crime and radicalization. Examples of how Adolf Hitler led an entire Nazi army against Jews, and which has led to one of the worst genocides that mankind has ever seen. Even the most lethal terrorist organization currently active calls itself the Islamic State because its members believe in views of radical nationalism for an autonomous Islamic State. Now that we've safely established that the current version of nationalism is leaves us at a very dangerous and worse off state, it is also important to understand the difference between nationalism and patriotism, because the definition of the difference between the two has been skewed throughout. Panel, patriotism in its true essence is a belief that a person, a patriot, will regard their country with regard with their country's interest or their country's pedestal at very high regard. But that does not mean that that very person will think that their country is superior, or they will attach some inferiority to another country, or or take part in power struggles or world dominance. That is the basic inherent difference between nationalism and patriotism, and it is making a lot of difference in the current narrative. Now, in talking about humanism is not about global citizenship, and this debate is not about a single nation versus the entire world. Humanism in its entirety is basically a belief that which advocates individual harmony and autonomy. It is a belief that if individuals follow, the masses follow. It has the capability to undo the effects caused by radical nationalism. The basic premise of humanism is that a person will look for the greater good and wellness, and they will affirm a dignity. Now, let us understand why affirming a dignity and individual dignity is so important in the current narrative. It is important, panel, because in a state, in a country which has been infested by radical nationalism, minorities have been oppressed. And what this operation does is it does not give them equal pedestal and equal stand. Humanism stands for giving them equal opportunities, equal pedestal, and that makes a larger difference because then they have representation. And basically, panel, in radical nationalism, what is happening is that each war is a war against someone's identity, and that is leading to more polarization of the masses, something which will see forward also. At this point, I'd like to take an example. Panel, we all are in the middle of, and we have seen the aftermath of a pandemic unfolding at us. Now, in that pandemic, what we saw was each nation had its own struggles, and as a result, there were a lot of internal crises happening in every nation, be it the lack of medical infrastructure, be it some other logistical or military problems. But panel, even that, there were countries who stood up and came for mutual benefit and started trading supplies for PPO kits, for vaccines, and other vital components of medical infrastructure. Panel, this again comes on to show what humanism stands for. It stands for the fact that you, as a nation, hold your own interest in high regard, but also do not indulge in other radical nationalisms, but you also but you also consider people of other nation in high regard, and that makes a lot of difference. That you are not basically polarized or driven by selfish intent, and that you are able to recognize humans above all as humans and not citizens of a particular state. Panel, this very premise is very important. Now, this makes me move towards my final point. That is that, panel, we are currently living in a world that is easily globalized and connected. That is to say that we are at the prime of global communication and connection. Now, what the importance of this point is that a person living in a particular nation can easily connect with a person living from a particular nation 5,000 or 10,000 miles away only with a click of a button. That is to say that interaction between people of two different nations is inevitable. This all leads us to believe that humanism at this point is a more important and plausible concern in the current scenario, because panel, the problems that we face, that the world faces currently, like climate change, is not a problem that is selective to a particular nation. That is the world's problem. So at this point, humanism advocates a scenario that all the countries and all the nations come together and use their collective resources and collective manpower to combat international problems, and that has made all the difference. So currently, I've highlighted all the important why humanism stands as a best case scenario currently, and why nationalism is a worst off. And I think uh, I'm proud to propose.
Thank you so much. From the opposition side, we would like to call upon the leader of opposition now for their opening case.
Just 1 minute.
Whenever you're ready.
Panel. So I would like to put my case forward, and after I have given my own description of the case, I would rebut the PM's point. Now let's talk about nationalism first. Okay, what do we mean by nationalism? Now, nationalism is basically the actions or attitude, that a person or the members of a particular nation inculcate for them to, achieve self-determination and to actually have a national identity. In my entire speech, I'll tell you that, what is the importance of this national identity? What is the value of this national identity? Why do we need it? And how this national identity further leads to self-determination. Talking about national identity, in a world where globalization is pacing up with such a speed and there's a lot of cultural mixing that taking place, it is very important to have a national identity, where people have a sense of self. In a world where everything is changing, people need something to fall back on. They need something that is stable. They need something which is constant, and that is the national identity for them. And this is not an irrational need, because that is what human nature is. They tend to become vulnerable whenever they are in danger. They need something consolidated. They need something which is important. They need something. They want something, that they know that they are being taken care of. This sense of belonging and then sense of security and safety is very important for them as humans to survive. And you need to understand that whenever a person identifies with a certain nation's ideology and consider a nation's its safe space, it further leads to a trust building. Now I'll tell you that why that trust building is so crucial to human life. If you know that you're being looked upon, if you know that you have a safe space, if you know that there is a certain body which is looking after you particularly, you tend to make better decisions. You are empowered to make better decisions and better life choices. And this is why it is and this is crucial for you to achieve self determination, for you to have a good quality of lifestyle, which will not be available if you do not have a national identity. Also also um, the proposition came and they explained that how nationalism is one of the reasons that why the world is so divided, why all the boundaries have consolidated. Well, I'll tell you why that nationalism is actually the bonding force that we need. No government can actually work without nationalism. And if the proposition is assuming that the concept of universal government is going to work, that one government for everyone, well, they're highly wrong. And I'll tell you why. You need to understand that people have different identities, they have different cultures, they have different religions, and they have different ethnicity, which results in having different needs. There's no way that one government body can come and actually fulfill all those needs and can cater to all those needs. You cannot have one kind of government for everyone. The the idea the idea um, and if they think that nationalism is what is going to break them apart, they're highly wrong. Nationalism is actually forming the basis of democracy, because when people are actually invested in the national interest, when they're actually invested in like the national interest, and they want to actually engage in what is happening in the country, they will take part in the country. And that is when they will actually make better decisions for everyone who forms a part of the nation and for themselves. Also also it is very important here to note that nationalism and national identity is not based on religious or tribal loyalties, which is to say it is much more stable, and it is much more stable, and it is much more solid. Why? Because we know that how people tend to get very intolerant towards each other on the basis of religion and gender. There is no way that you could contain Hindus, like who worship cow, and Muslims who Muslims who eat cow. There's no way that you could put them in one country if it was not for a national identity. There is no way, with people with such strong belief systems and with such strong differences, there is no way that you can bind them together without a force that is not based on their religions, their gender, or their ethnicity. Why? There's one more reason that nationalism acts as a uniting factor. When people identify with a nation, and when people identify with the nation's ideology, they are committed towards bettering that nation. They are committed towards actually working towards the nation, to becoming better individuals and becoming better individuals for that nation. Also, humanism, as dreamy as it sounds, is very flawed in its own way. For the very simple that it is a very chaotic concept, and I'll tell you why. For the very simple reason that it's actually blurring the differences that blurring the inherent differences that actually exist between humans. It's treating them everyone equally without, and it's just like it's actually admonishing all the differences that actually exist, and it's imposing a lifestyle or a way of living that is to be followed by everyone. Also, like, I would go on to the some of the rebuttals to Piyush's points. Here they assume that nationalism is the cause of all the conflicts that take place, of all the wars and everything is that taking place. Tell us why nationalism is the exclusive evil. Tell us that why these wars will not take place when in terms of religion, and let's say in terms of gender biases, in terms of other dividing forces that exist. Secondly, they say that political heads manipulate the people. And this is what I'm trying to tell you, that, political heads, if you're at a point of privilege, only then you can manipulate people. And I just explained it to you that how, nationalism is engaging more people to take part in this government making process and actually take more responsibility. They tell us that there's a sense of superiority that exists. Tell us that why the sense of superiority will not exist in your case. Like how are you preventing any other divide that is bound to exist in your place? Also, they tell us that minorities have been oppressed because of this approach of nationalism. This is where nationalism becomes even more important. When you've blurred all the differences, when you're treating everyone as equal, you're actually invisibilizing the suffering that the minority suffered. And when you do that, when you treat them as equal, you do not make reparations or amendments for the suffering that they suffered. Which is to say that if there was no, if there is no nationalism, there's not going to be reservation, there's not going to be affirmative action, because you've actually invisibilized those differences and you've actually invisibilized the suffering the minorities actually went through. And this is inhuman in its intrinsic nature and very ironical to what they actually believe. Very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much. After the LO speech, we'll now have the Deputy Prime Minister elaborating more on their substance.
Yeah, I'll just start in like 30 seconds.
Sure.
All right. Panel, first of all, let me clear some of the misconceptions that the side government is having right now regarding our case. First of all, when we say that we do not support celebrating nationalism and we instead would rather have conversations around us on humanism rather than nationalism, we do not mean that there should be no boundaries or there should be no national governments. There should be one universal government. That is not what we mean. What we mean when we say that we do not want to glorify nationalism is that we have a problem with the idea of how the nationalism ideology is perceived and how the government or the dominant political parties are selling the idea of nationalism, at least to the common people of the country, and how it is so much harmful that we need to completely abolish it. I'll elaborate that in my later part of speech, but before that I just tackle some of the points taken forward by the team government. They talk about how nationalism or driven by the force of being in one country would actually unify religions and the different cultures would come in one place. I tell you a scenario where something like being of not a dominant religion would actually give you a tag of anti-national, or speaking something against what the majority political dominant party is propagating, speaking anything against that, speaking like going against the NRCCA Act would mean that would give you a tag of anti-national. I then asked the team government how this nationalism ideology is bringing the religions together or actually diverting them. And I'll elaborate further upon how this majoritarianism and nationalism have too much small of a difference that they are intertwined within each other. At least that is how the government is selling that to the common people of the country. I'll come to that later in my speech. But secondly, they also talk about how incentive to become better individuals come to people when they are driven by this force of celebrating the pride of their country. I tell you, that is a merit that is not exclusive to their side. That is something that would also exist in our case of scenario. We are not telling you that just abolish boundaries. We are not telling you that we are a one whole nation and we will not protect you. The whole idea, I'll not take my POIs till the last minute. We do not tell you that the nation will not protect you and will not give you the sense of belonging that it holds. The divisions are there. We are not telling you to abolish the divisions. We are telling you to respect the divisions in such a way that you do not consider the life of someone who is from across the boundary to be less valuable than someone who is within your boundary. The whole concept of our people, the whole concept of our people is valuable only till the point till then it does not become that their people are not as valuable as ours, and that is something that we need to propagate in the society. They tell you all the merits of how nationalism provides all of this. What we come ahead and tell you that at this point of scenario, if we continue having discussions about nationalism, this is not going to change, or the harm that we provide to you is not going to be tackled in any way scenario. What instead, if we do have conversations on something like humanism, because nationalism is so much dominant and so much integrated in the society, that these merits would not be replaced, and in fact they would also exist in our scenario as well, even as we talk about, they would continue to exist. But if we incorporate humanism, and if we have conversations around why something like going ahead and just something like going ahead against your government and protecting the pride of other people because you do think that their life is as valuable as yours, is something that would come across when we have conversations about humanism, and that is kind of a change that we want to portray in the society. Right, then they talk about manipulating people to take more responsibility by the government. First off, I don't think that an argument like that should exist in a country like India, where a party like BJP just comes up and just very blatantly says, like, just tag a Muslim person as anti-national just because a comedian has said something about it on a stand-up stage. So something like that coming from as us, like citizens of India, does not seem any fair to me. Like the government is manipulating people for the nation's good and not for the political party's good and for the majority's good. So that is something that I'll throw more light upon. And the whole minority, I'll just prove it to you that how in our case the minorities are much well, and as compared to their case where they are like worse off. Okay, so let me talk about how the idea of nationalism is supremely bad. Let us see if we can divide the nationalism and majoritarianism at all in the current scenario. In a country like India, where the government plays with the rationale of people, plays with the emotions of people, and tell to them that if you feel associated with the country, if you want to be associated with the feeling of being Indian, then you have to fall. Then you don't. Then you don't have any right to criticize the government. Then you will be called national, and otherwise, if you just make any Instagram post that criticize the actions of the government because they do not come across, because they don't fit in their majority political agenda. The whole radical nationalism Piyush elaborated so bloody well in his speech. Something like that happening is just a proof of how government just manipulates the whole nationalism idea into their merit, and majority wins in every case scenario. Government want votes, they want the majority to be happy and satisfied at all points, and that is what majoritarianism comes into picture. The minority groups benefiting from their idea is never going to happen in real case scenario. Take the case of America, of racism, take the case of the Trump Mexican thing, take the case of India, take any case, you'll get a clear picture of how this whole nationalism is in every way just going to take off the benefits from minority, which is something that if happens in a society, then we principally stand to win the case. If already worsen off branches of society are getting more worsen off, then this is enough of a harm to stop glorifying and celebrating nationalism as an ideology. Rather, what happens when humanism comes into picture is that people talk about how something like a value of a life of Israel's Israeli citizen is as valuable as that of a Palestinian citizen, and they do not then support the attacks or the war crimes happening in the whole of the world. You have to understand the relevance of our people and their people, and we need to attack the whole terrorism ideology or how it is portrayed. That is something that we stand against when we have conversations around humanism and how this is so much needed right now to bring a positive change in society. With that, very proud to propose.
Thank you so much. That was our DPM speech. To continue further on the opposition side, I would like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Please elaborate your substance.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah. Sure.
Just give me a few seconds and we'll start.
Sure.
Right. I'll start in three, two, one. Panel, let's first understand some things about the basic human nature, right? We think that this debate fundamentally boils down to what humans are like, right? How do you motivate human beings to do certain things the way that they do them, right? And we think that it boils down to giving human beings a vision of a nation, a vision of a unit, a vision of a whole that they can aspire to make, like to help that entire unit progress forward for their own glory and for the glory of other people. And on the other hand, this is nationalism, right? On the other hand, you have a fundamental feeling of personal individualism, right? You tell yourself that I am the most important person in the world, that everything that happens in the world has to benefit me in some way, or at least I should never be at a loss, right? This is ultimately what this debate boils down to, right? Me taking a hit for the entire nation's progress versus me always thinking about myself. And we think that despite all of the examples that have been given by side government, we think that this nationalism idea, this idea of us consisting as a whole, of us progressing for a whole, we think that this idea applies very well, right? And how do we try and tackle this problem, right? Firstly, we see that humans are in general very apathetic creatures, right? We have a limited social sphere of who we can care about. That social sphere will probably consist of maybe 10 to 15 people, maybe 50 people, but beyond that we don't really care about people, right? We may have on the off chance think about a certain Israeli child that maybe is suffering somewhere, but do we actually go ahead and donate to those people? Do we actually go ahead and give our whole life to that one particular person? No, we don't, because that is basic human nature. Because basic human nature will dictate that you will only care for a few certain people in your life. The moment that you reinforce this idea that you should only care about yourself, that you are not responsible for anyone else in this world, that you as an individual are the most important unit, we think that things start to break down on the entire scale of the world. People start becoming very selfish. They no longer care about people within their own country, outside countries, and we think that that is very problematic in the first place, right? They try and like tackle nationalism with like very specific examples of how nationalism is being skewed away from what it can be, right? We think that this is something that exists on both sides. Even humanism is something that can be skewed. It is something that can be misused, in the sense that a lot of people today are apathetic because they think that there is nothing in this world that we have to live for, and therefore we don't really need to care about anything other than ourselves, right? And we think that that is the moment where you stop caring about things like bringing equality to all people, right? They say that humanism in an ideal situation will allow you to do that, right? That it will force us to think about people and every single person outside our social sphere, outside our XYZ things, right? But we think that that is not what is likely to happen because of like the various examples that we see in everyday life. Just like I said, you don't really care about that Israel kid. You may be feeling empathetic about them for a few minutes and a day, but that's it. But then why do we think that nationalism gives us this very, very important boost, right? We think that nationalism in itself is something that has allowed human beings to like economically and morally become the species that we are today, right? It is something that drives us, right? It is something that has allowed us to collectivize, or like based on an idea that there is something bigger than us that we need to work towards, and only based on that idea we work towards it, right? And we think like whether that be religion, whether that be culture, whether that be some other XYZ things, that idea existing and us working towards that together is something that is very important to the human spirit, and something that is very, very important to human progress, right? And this is what we've seen, right? The only reason why nation states have come as far as they have is because people have this idea of wanting to like make progress within the nation, wanting to put India at a higher pedestal, right? And even a lot of the sense of the apathy that we feel for, of the sympathy that we feel for other nations is in a relative status, right? They say that relativeness is bad, right? That countries being graded on a level from 100 to 0 is bad. We say that that is something that is actually beneficial because it gives aspirational value to countries who are right now at a 0 who want to go to 100. It gives us as say Indians an aspirational value to reach to the levels of say USA and work towards that goal, right? If we become apathetic, if we demolish this idea of a nation, if we only focus on the individual, then there is no progress being made because we only focus on ourselves. We are never focused on finishing the caste boundaries, the cultural boundaries that exist, the economic boundaries that exist, right? Because as a nation we understand that together is the only way that we can make progress. I will take a POI from Sakshi.
Right. We talk about how incentive is something that is so much more valuable or so much more reliable on your side. But I ask you that why is it exclusive if we are not telling you to have one universal government or not being relative with the nation's progress? We're just telling you that the idea or the celebration of nationalism, the way it is being currently perceived in society, is bad. So how do you tackle that?
All right, two things, right? First of all, about the celebration of nationalism. We think that you can celebrate nationalism just like countries like New Zealand, right? New Zealand is a country where people are celebrating nationalism by taking pride in the fact that their country is completely against climate change, that their country is actively doing things to fight climate change, their country is actively trying to make up for what the past problems that they did with the aboriginal people. These are things that nationalism can be, right? These are things that if people collectivize together, if they accept the true meaning of nationalism, then that is something that they can do. And this has been done time and again in the past, in the present, and we think that this is far more practical and far more actually going to probable to happen on the ground, right? Why do we think that it is not probable that the moment you pin the individual as a person who of importance, why that is not likely to happen, right? And we, like I said, the logic is very clear. Human beings have a basic instinct to only care about very few people, right? The moment you don't give them that idea to believe in, that 10 more people believe in that same idea as me, and therefore for that idea I should progress, the moment you stop doing that, you take that incentive of people to care for others away, right? I as an Indian will care about a person from Assam as much as I will care for a person from Kerala, because I know that all of us are united by this idea of India, of this nationality, right? The moment you take that away, the moment you say that you are first and foremost individual, then Kerala's, we think that things like this can never happen, right? Why do you think Indians are proud of the fact that we won a medal in Olympics, and we want to improve, right? We want to do things to essentially improve our status. We think that it is only the spirit of nationalism that allows us to do that. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much. Continuing with the proposition side, I would like to call upon the government with to conclude your case.
I'll take 10 seconds before I start my speech.
Sure, whenever you are ready.
Okay, I'll start in three, two, one. So, firstly, let's understand what this debate eventually boils down to. Right, this debate eventually boils down to suffering of multiple identities, which I'll be elaborating in the later part of my speech, and the most that this united front or this nationalism provides. Right, here as an adjudicator, you have to understand where the lines are to be drawn. Right, the value of life of a minority is more important, or the kind of boost that they eventually talk about is more important, something that I'll also cater about in the later part of my speech. But we go ahead and tell you that the moment we prove to you principally how a minority's life is better off in our scenario is the moment we take this debate away principally, right? And secondly, I'll be talking about the impacts of nationalism and how this impacts worse of the socially oppressed minorities in a lot of countries, right? Okay, so the fallacies and desertions in the op case, right? Moving on to that, right? Uh, they go ahead and say that how self-determination grants you a better life. We believe that this is a big assertion, and the fact that they didn't mechanize this, how the mechanism of this works, right, is the moment we do not buy into or tap into this line of argumentation, because value of life can be completely exclusive of having of self-determination at the first place, right? They go ahead and talk to you about how having something to fall back is so important, that principally suffering of minorities can be overlooked on this, right? Something that we believe is entirely problematic, because principally you cannot like look away on the fact that someone is being suffered or a minority is being suffered, right? They go ahead and tell you that how progress and motivation to do something is exclusive to having a united front. We believe that this is not entirely exclusive to having a united front. Progress and aspiration and inspiration and motivation to do everything is not entirely exclusive to having a united front. This can work when this united front does not exist, or the importance that this united front that they are giving to does not exist, right? We go ahead and tell you that nationalism has a very ambiguous definition, and the definition of nationalism is controlled by the people who have privilege, who have power, right? And I'll mechanize you how this power and privilege plays very, very important role when we talk about nationalism, right? Understand that nationalism means holding a nation together, putting forward the interest of nation, right? They very well the opposition very well went ahead and told you that how these interests of nation are being catered to by nationalism, something that we don't buy into, because interests of nations are being decided by governments who are in power. And understand that these governments emotionally appeal people to by forming certain exclusive identities. In countries like India, they form an identity called Hindutva, and literally emotionally appeal to a lot of Hindus, and then form a common enemies, form a common enemies, right, on these bases, right? And this is what gives rise to a lot of movements like populism, something that happened in the United States of America, where Donald Trump united a lot of conservative white old age people to a common enemy, which was Latin Americans and a lot of Muslims, right? Which eventually increases a lot of oppression, a lot of social oppression of these minorities who are very, very worse off in the social structures, something that they ignored, right? Moving on to the second point, right? How in this scenario humanism holds a moral high ground. The moment when you don't have something to emotionally appeal to people, you don't have something to question people and question their own rationale, is the moment where we believe humanism holds a moral high ground, because the idea of humanism ensures that you will be eventually treating people equally, right? Which is something very, very important in the world we're living in right now, where minorities are being continuously oppressed because of this emotionally appealing done by governments to consolidate privilege and power which they have, right? And understand that the moment yeah, Jasleen, I'll take your question.
What is the foundation of this moral high ground that you're talking about?
Yeah, the moment when we tell you that humanism, the idea of humanism promotes treating people equally, looking past their races, ethnicities, and the kind of caste and the structures that they belong to, is the moment this humanism holds a moral high ground over nationalism, because nationalism is something which is very, very skewed by the governments who are in power and who want to consolidate privilege. And the true essence of nationalism does not exist in the world that we are living in today. Hence, all the arguments that they give you, which is that how these interests are being catered to in nationalism, is something that we don't buy into, because a lot of minorities' interests will continuously be neglected in the world where ideas of nationalism is being promoted, because the government wants to consolidate privilege, and to do that they will continuously tap into the rationale of majorities, and would make majorities question that, and to feel more superior, they would like constantly emotionally appeal them against something, and this would unite them, and that unity is in and of itself problematic, which you talk about. Also, they go ahead and ask us that how wars are an exclusive harm of nationalism, something that I'll prove to you by an example. The reason why United States of America has hegemonized a lot of united structures, for example, United Nations of Security Council, and they constantly break a lot of conventions, is because they've put themselves into a position where they believe that they are superior. And this is what nationalism does on an external level, that countries feel that we are superior to others, and hence this, provokes a lot of harms on a global level. Something that we see United States of America constantly intervening in a lot of wars in the Middle East is a direct harm of nationalism. And hence we say that this is an exclusive harm to nationalism, right? And they ask us that how this oppression is an exclusive harm to nationalism. The moment where we tell you that the people who have privilege and power tap into they emotionally appeal people to a common enemy, is the moment where this oppression, the social oppression, the vicious cycle of this social oppression becomes a constant harm of nationalism. Something that we, constantly talk about in our speeches. Also their case is flawed, because they go ahead and tell you that how nationalism unites you. They never tell you why this unity is something more important than the value of life of a minority. Something that we tell, and something that we take away principle. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now the concluding speech from the opposition side. I'll call upon the opposition whip to conclude your stance.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just take 10 seconds here.
Yeah, sure. Whenever you're ready.
I'll start in three, two, one. All right, panel. So first of all, we need to understand that when the government comes here and talks about the fact that this debate is about minorities, they have just conveniently stated the fact that the concept of nationalism is undermining the concept of minorities and the side of minorities, while not in themselves even giving a single aspect as to how humanism would help minorities. Because if you think about the fact that if we're considering all humans to be equal, we clearly know that in our current realities, equality is not what we need right now. What we need right now is equity. And the fact that they're not able to understand that clearly indicates that the sense of minority and the sense of minorities being marginalized will not be catered in their side as well. Talking about the individual's dignity in itself may be important, but the fact that if this dignity and this individual dignity hones into individualism is the fundamental crux of the issue, which is humanism. Because humanism in itself is not going to be catering to the masses or going to be catering to the execution of the execution of improvement of humanity in itself, but the individual improvement of each person. Because in the end, like Anmol said in his speech, that apathy is one of the key factors of humankind, which is why we can think about people in our friend circle or in our most common circles, which are like 10 people, 20 people, 30 people. But beyond that, we are pretty apathetic about the fact that other people exist, and sure, we can give no to them for like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, but apart from that, we are not in its entirety worrying about that, which is a key problem, which is why the whole concept of nationalism, which is giving you a unit, which is giving you a body, is very, very crucial, because it is making you think about people more than yourself. It is making you think about people beyond your own circles. It is making you think about the general nation in itself, which is going to lead to progress. Because when you work as a collective, when you work as a unit, even though one person may take a hit, the entire masses would be making progress, which eventually is going to be in lieu of the fact that humanity will be making progress in itself. Moving on to the fact that why having why having something to fall back on is important. That is something which is entirely that is something which is a human factor. That is something which is a human trait, that we as humans feel more comfortable. We as humans have faith when we have something to fall back on. We as humans make better, more rational decisions when we have something to fall back on. If we take away the whole fundamental that there's nothing to fall back on, then our decisions would be barely risk free, and that is never going to lead us to the fact that we want to make progress. Right now, moving on to the crucial problem with humanism, right? The fact that even though the side government keeps on harping on the fact that there is no global government, they not a single time, they not at any point of time are talking about the fact that humanism is dismissing ethnic, cultural as well as physical attributes, which are key in terms of being familiar with people, which is key in terms of grouping, which is key in terms of their differences. And not at a single point of time, at any point in this debate, has the government come up and talked about the differences and acknowledging those differences, which are key and which are fundamental in itself. And the fact that we are not addressing these differences clearly shows that we are absolutely oblivious to these differences, and we are not even in any aspect pandering to them, which is something which we desperately need to do. Moving on to the fact that moving on to the arguments given by side government, there were multiple words used in this debate which were just used baselessly, and the fact that they had no analysis creates a fundamental hole in their debate. Talking about things like using the word anti-national without defining what they're trying to imply with that, without implying or without defining what they are meaning by those using those words. Secondly, the whole point of humanism, right? The entire debate which they are trying to project in this current scenario is about humanism, and how even though they do not believe in removing boundaries, even though they do not believe in a global government, they're not even defining what humanism is in itself. And regardless of that, they're not even talking about which is something which is more important, which is the execution of this humanism. Because it is very easy for us to just sit here and talk about what are absolute and what are idealistic things which every human should do, but that is not humanism. What humanism is, and the fact that this entire debate from side government has been devoid of the execution of humanism is something which needs to be which needs to be something that is to be kept in mind, because it is a huge gaping hole in their side of the debate. Moving on to the fact that they have taken single examples like India or maybe Trump to back their entire debate is something which is ridiculously problematic, because it gives analysis about one country, about one person, but not about the entirety of the concept in itself, which needs to be addressed, but it is not, right? And also, side government comes up and says that nationalism is ambiguous. Both these terms are surely ambiguous, but the fact is that what we derive from this is more important, and the fact that nationalism in itself is bringing unity, is bringing a collective, is bringing a body which is eventually going to make progress, is definitely way more progressive than using humanism as an individualistic perspective, like Anmol said, talking about people in Israel but just giving it a 10-minute low of perspective and not even giving a second thought after that. That is not humanism. That is not being subjective about the definition of humanism. That is in its entirety being ambiguous about the definition in itself, which is something which is way more problematic than the current nationalism that we have right now. Moving on to the fact that the side government comes up and says that nationalism can be moved over to populism. The counter question could be, how are we making sure that humanism in itself is not clinging on to the sheer desperation of individualism? Because like we said, and like what we have been arching on deeply in this debate, is that the essence of humanism is about collectively progressing as humans. And we believe that our side of the narrative is definitely making more progress in the significance of humankind in itself, whereas humanism, the the definition proposed by side government of humanism, is going to be giving progress to an individual who is not going to have any drive, who is not going to have any reason or desire to make progress as a nation or as a collective or as a group or as humanity in itself, because he, she, or they will be so busy talking about their own progress, about their own issues. And at this point, I just feel that side government has confused the two fundamental points, which are government and a nation. A nation has a government. The government of a nation is not the nation in itself. If the government is making propagandas, if the government is making statements which can lure the masses, the government can be replaced. The nation in its entirety will be stable, but the government can be replaced. The government in itself is not the nation, which is something which are two terms which should not be used in correlation or as synonyms, because they are not so. Also talking about the fact that humanism in itself, in actuality, what actually humanism is about morals, is about morals of people. And the fact that morals are subjective is something which needs to be remembered. And with that, I would like to end my debate. Very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you so much. So, concluding with all these speeches, opposition, would you like to take a common minute for your reply speech?
Yes.
Shashi, do you mind if I take just 10 seconds more, please?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. All right. So I think eventually what this debate has primarily been about is about each individual's identity, each individual's responsibility as a human in the terms of progress of humanity. What matters more is the fundamental definitions of these two terms. The issue is that because of the ambiguity in both in the definitions of these two terms, constantly throughout this debate, no certain no certain stagnant definition has been stuck upon. What we need to realize is the definition proposed by side government of humanism is not subjecting to to the overall progress of humanity in itself. What it is what it is projecting towards is towards individualism, is what it is projecting towards is towards the fundamental concept of my success, of my progress. That is not something which we are looking forward to, right? That is something which we are trying to discuss, which we are trying to demotivate, and what we're trying to do as a collective, as a race, or as humankind, is something which we need to move in a you know collectively decided direction of progress. That can only be done when you have some drive to do so. If you do not have that drive, and the only way that we have provided in this argument is that this drive can be derived from from a sense of collectiveness, from a sense of group, from a sense of a nation, from a sense of familiarity, from a sense of knowing each other and feeling comfort in each other's company. That in itself is a huge reason why there is that in itself is a huge reason why people would have drive to do better, why people would have a drive to make change which would be in progress, or in benefit for humanity in itself. Because now every single day when we walk around, we see people around us who are familiar, who we can relate to, who we are familiar with. That is something which drives us every single day to make progress, right? And that is something which we need to keep in mind. Also, the fact that in this entire debate, multiple terms being used just for the sake of their use is something which is being very detrimental in this debate by side government, which is something which we need to think about. The fact that we can just use random words just for the sake of the argument is not something that will that will lead to the argument which you're trying to provide, and that is something which has to be addressed in this debate. Also, the fundamental fact that at no point of time has side government in this debate been able to prove that nationalism is not providing unity, that nationalism is not providing a sense of familiarity, nationalism is not able to provide a sense of comfort to fall back on, is something which is why we feel that we should win this debate in the first place. Because if that in itself is something which can provide a human drive, is good enough. And also the fact that side government has been constantly talking about the minorities and talking about how minorities are being marginalized in nationalism is something which has been entirely baseless in this whole debate. And the fact that in their own narrative and in their own direction which they are trying to um promote, they have not addressed minorities or their ethnic differences or their cultural differences or their physical differences or any form of differences in humankind in their own narrative. Because if you're talking about humanism and a sense of empathy which is apparently driving from anywhere, that is idealistic. The concept of deriving empathy from random absurdity is idealism. You can't expect people to be empathetic for no reason at all. You need to have some reason for people to be empathetic about, because empathy is not a trait granted to is not a trait which comes natural to humans. Apathy is a trait which comes natural to humans. The ability to be independent, the ability to think about oneself. That is why the sense of a nation, the sense of a nationality, the sense of something to cling on to something which can actually provide you a fallback, something which takes into consideration your own morals, something a place where the laws are based on your subjective morals, which are pandering to you as a nation, not as a majority, is something which is deeply important right now. And that is why nationality and a national identity is very, very important. Because what we need to realize is that the laws made in a nation, the morals in a nation which are collectively owned by the people of the nation, are what are driving the people of the nation, are what are driving humankind in itself. Which is why we need to think about such things. And with that, I would like to conclude my speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the reply speech. Uh, I would like to call upon the government for the reply speech.
All right. Just starting in three, two, one. Panel, let me clarify this thing once and for all, and for the last time. We have focused and emphasized on this parameter enough, that when we say that we are approaching towards a nation, approaching towards a world which celebrates and have a conversation around humanism more than it glorifies nationalism already. What we talk about is a scenario where nationalism is something that has already been so much celebrated and is dominant in the minds of people, that adding humanism in the conversation and replacing nationalism does not take away from the minds of the athletes that they need to win for their country. We are accepting of the fact that there are boundaries and there should be healthy competition, which is very, very necessary for the relative growth of the countries in general. But what we oppose is that the blur line between healthy competition and just killing the other people of the other country to win across and to come across as a superior power is something that is so blurred and it is so much intertwined and mixed right now, that the merits that they provide to you of something like glorifying having an incentive for doing something for their nation is something that is so insignificant. And even if it is very much important to them, it also exists in our paradigm. So I just do not realize that how they are saying that it is something that is only exclusive and to their side, because nations and boundaries do exist in our side as well, because of the fact that nationalism is in the minds of people for so much long, and they do respect that they need to do something for their country. But now replacing the glorification of nationalism with humanism, what it does is that it prevents war crimes, it prevents the thinking or the mentality ideology of the people. When when someone from other country gets attacked by the force of our country, then I, as a citizen of, for example, many people, when during the Vietnam situation, many people from USA protested against it because they had that kind of empathy. And the whole idea that they developed, that humans do not have an empathy, they only need they need to be associated it to something, then I say that we are not taking away your association of empathy to your nation or protecting your own people. Please go ahead and protect your own people. But what we demand of you is that you, when you think of life of one person from your own country and a life of another person from other country, you do not think that you are superior to them just because you have some high economic growth or something like that. Then they throw away this whole idea of differences and ethnic culture thing going on. Let me tell you that, for example, just take a common analogy to that. When we say that every student in this class is equal, or every citizen in this country is equal, irrespective of the ethnicity or race or religion, we do not mean that you have to abolish the difference, that the male cannot be male anymore. They have to be like, if female needs to be equal to male, they have to be have the same characteristics. We do not say that. What we say is that due to those differences, you have no right to go ahead and say that the life of that person, just because they are different from us in nationality, is less valuable than ours. I do not understand what kind of case they are building by saying something like differences or culture is so important. I totally agree to that. They are so much important. We are not abolishing them. In fact, what we are doing is respecting them and still treating the people as equals. Two persons can be treated equal even with acknowledging all of their differences. That is the point that we try to make when we bring humanism into conversation, which is something that is so much needed right now, which will increase the kind of empathy question. They talk about how empathy is not in human beings, that's just how human nature is. That is why we need the conversation of humanism. That is why we do need people talking about on social media that this is happening, that whatever is going on right now, it is very wrong, and we need to stand in solidarity with other people, even if they belong to any other nation, because that is the kind of thing that that needs to develop that empathy. And then they say that nation is not equal to government. Agreed, nation is not equal to government, but government is one that drives the whole ideology of nationalism to people. And it is not something that is very just subjective to India. It happens worldwide. It just depends on what kind of government a country has. And even if you change the government, which you cannot do on this basis, we still think that this situation will arise time and again. With that, very proud to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was a lovely debate and hope everyone liked it. Thank you so much.